Yeah.
No, when you try to sign in from a new place, they'll text it to you. You have a phone number. I only know that because I had a Gmail account recently. And so I'm trying to get it on Friday. There's one of the 50 teenagers around that's been invited to attend the Millwall. There's no phone number that says all this and stuff. So, guess what argument's happening at home? Who gets to go? Right, it's my turn. And of course, Tyler's saying, but I don't need to show. No. Why do we need anyone to go with me? I'm 16. It is my turn. Cairo for 2 weeks. Ministry of Education wants their teacher, right? She'll be going back to you. They want her to do curriculum, assessments and stuff. And okay. Outstanding. Yeah. Yeah. It was a marvelous trip.
Yeah, I mean, I have to get the teachers. So I would have to do this.
Oh yeah. She knew how stressful it was here. Okay, and I will switch the screen. Make sure this is and then tell her you know, the computer screen will be the easiest way for you. So you don't keep just right. Okay. How'd it go? Just sit and sit. Yeah. Well, you never know.
We're ready to get started. If everyone could have a seat, please. I will say welcome. I'm Gail Sansnet. I'm the Associate Director of the Bob Graham Center, in charge of the public programs, and we are so glad to see you all here tonight. We want to thank the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere for sponsoring this program with support from Rothman Endowment and the School of Teaching and Learning, along with us, the Bob Graham Center. I want to remind you to turn off your cell phones. I also want to note that the Follow Bookstore is here selling a couple of Dr. Dalton's books, and I'm sure she will be happy to sign them when the program is over here in the corner. And they noted to me that they're 20% less here than they are on Amazon. So if you're interested, over there in the corner is that. And then now to introduce our program, and the speaker is Dr. Sivan Terzian, who is a professor and associate director of graduate studies at the College of Education.
Well, I've already been introduced, so I'll simply say welcome to our talk this evening that is titled From Heroes to Hacks, The Disturbing Rise of Bad Teachers on Television, featuring our esteemed guest, Professor Mary Dalton of Wake Forest University. It's also part of the Public School Awareness Month in Gainesville and Greater Alachua County, so this is an especially timely subject for us today. And tonight's keynote is also the first of 3 events. In case you are not fully aware, tomorrow morning we have at 10 o'clock a book panel discussion with Professor Dalton about popular media representations of education, and immediately following at 11, Professor Dalton will be leading a workshop on teaching with media. And both events will be held in the terrace room in Norman Hall in the College of Education, and all are welcome to attend, which promises to be a very engaging morning. Popular scrutiny of schools and teachers in particular have long been part of American culture. In his short story from 1820, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, American writer Washington Irving portrayed the fictional teacher Ichabod Crane, you know, the guy who saw the Headless Horseman, as erudite but physically awkward. He was tall but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat on top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. As the emerging teaching profession became increasingly feminized, ensuing generations would encounter fictional portrayals of the equally awkward schoolmarm. Some cultural representations of professional educators also yielded heroic portraits of altruistic mother-like figures who devoted their entire lives to the well-being of their students. With the proliferation of mass media over the past century or so, popular representations of teachers and schools have become ever more visible and impactful. But they've also seemed to become increasingly unflattering. One need only recount the infamous figure of the economics teacher in the 1980s film Ferris Bueller's Day Off, who droned on, or the sound asleep teacher in the shop room in Dazed and Confused from recent decades. These images are not merely incidental, as they both reflect and inform popular perceptions of both teachers in school and society, and it's no secret that American schools have endured heightened degrees of scrutiny recently. So we're really fortunate to have Professor Mary Dalton here to share her expertise and insights on these fascinating and pressing issues. A professor of communication and film studies at Wake Forest University, Dr. Dalton teaches courses in media studies and production and any number of other things I've learned, unbelievably versatile. She has authored and edited numerous books on popular media schools in American society, some of which include, and are also here, The Hollywood Curriculum, Teachers in the Movies, now in its 3rd edition, Teacher TV, 60 Years of Teachers on Television, The Sitcom Reader, America Viewed and Skewed, and most recently, Screen Lessons, What We Have Learned from Teachers on Television and in the Movies. Here's something else. Professor Dalton is a prolific documentary filmmaker whose films have been screened and received recognition at festivals across the nation and abroad. Her titles include Oakdale Cotton Mills, Close-Knit Neighbors, Martha and Lattimore, Queer Knitter in the Queen City, and Living in the Overlap. It's evident through all of this that Professor Dalton approaches the issue of popular media portrayals of education from multiple perspectives, those of a scholar, teacher, and filmmaker. Finally, I want to add that I have long appreciated Professor Dalton's scholarship. She doesn't know this, but a number of years ago I attended one of her talks about visual media and education at the American Educational Research Association conference. I came away even more impressed by her keen insights about the interrelationships among popular culture and schooling in American society, and the ways in which she integrated media studies, cultural analysis, and educational problems in her discussion. And judging from the standing room only crowd in that meeting room, it was clear I wasn't the only one who thought so. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mary Dalton.
That was a very kind introduction. I really appreciate that. I want to say how grateful I am to be here. It was kind of an awkward trip. It's been planned for a long time. I didn't realize I'd have foot surgery. So I want to thank the graciousness of Elizabeth Curran and Stephanie Schroeder for organizing this wonderful event, and Chad Harris, who helped make sure that I could get here with my foot elevated on the way. I'm really delighted to talk with you about a topic that is really, I'm actually humbled by that introduction. I'm still a little overwhelmed by that, but I'm very happy to be here. I'm gonna take my watch off so that I can make sure that I leave plenty of time for you to ask questions and for us to have a conversation afterward. And I think conversation is the word that's most important to me in thinking about these television texts, thinking about films, thinking about media, because I really do think that that's what this is, a larger conversation that we have with the narratives. These are the books that were mentioned, and I do want to say that in the panel tomorrow, it won't be just me. There will be several of us talking about books, including one of the contributors to Screen Lessons. So I hope that you'll be able to attend maybe. What I want to start with is talking just a little bit about the history of television. And I'm going to follow sort of the pattern of the Teacher TV book, just to give you a little overview so that you can draw a contrast between what teachers looked like on television leading up to about late 90s, early 2000s, what they looked like before then, and then what they look like now. In the 1950s, I mean, have any of you ever seen an episode of either one of these shows, our Miss Brooks and Mr. Peepers? Which one? Both of them? Both of them. I find these shows fascinating, and what Laura and I did, because I co-authored the Teacher TV book with Laura Linder, what Laura and I did was to look, and this is an important thing in looking at any group of media texts or any individual text. You look at the TV show or the film, and I like to think through all kinds of possibilities. I look at all media texts from this sort of an intersectional approach before we actually talked too much about the word intersectionality. Douglas Kellner used to use a term where he talked about media studies that's multicultural and multi-perspectival. So when I look at a TV show or a film, I'm always looking at it with these multiple lenses and considering race, gender, class, sexuality, paying attention to those things, and then figuring out from there, what is the most compelling reading of this particular? What's the element that stands out? Considering them all, maybe writing about a couple, but figuring out what seems to be the most persuasive interpretation for that particular text. And in looking at these 1950s sitcoms, it was quite clear that you have Connie Brooks, who is one of the top 5 most popular teachers on sitcoms in the history of television, the only woman among the 5, and you have Mr. Peeper. So we looked particularly at our preconceptions about gender and teaching and how those played out in these 2 shows. And then in the 1960s, we looked particularly at race and social relevancy. It didn't make sense to look at race in the 1950s because it was mostly a period of whiteout. So there weren't any representations of teachers of color in that decade. But when you get into the 60s, you see that there's a sort of a new impetus. When the characters are introduced in shows toward the end of the 60s, characters of color, there's an attention that's paid to race, but there's also this idea that we are moving toward this sort of utopia where, you know, if we can just communicate well enough, we can all get along and we can work through our problems. It's much simpler on television, you know, when you're resolving within an hour or a half hour a certain issue than of course it is in real life, which brings its own sets of complications. In the 1970s, we looked particularly at social class and ideology, and looking at 2 very, very different series, Welcome Back, Kotter and The Paper Chase. We looked at the way that television tends to minimize class, and by doing so, perpetuating this idea of America as a classless society. That's harder to do now, obviously, because we've seen increasing disparities along the spectrum in terms of wealth. But at this point in time, you saw major patterns that were somewhat consistent, even though the shows themselves are very, very different. In the 1980s, the idea of normalizing meritocracy. Again, this is ideologically an important concept because just like this idea of minimizing class and looking at the narrative of being able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, regardless of whether there's a level playing field, feeds into the way that we have to use this idea of the meritocracy to justify the system. In the 1990s, we start to see some more complexity in the depictions of educators in television. I don't know if you've seen the show Hanging with Mr. Cooper. It was sort of up and down in terms of the ratings over its broadcast period, but it does end up being the 5th highest rated sitcom featuring teachers of the period. But then the show that is a real breakout, of course, is My So-Called Life. Have any of you seen that? It's gotten a kind of a cult status. It was only on the air for 1 season. It sort of launched the career of Claire Danes on television, and then she got kind of not very interested in the series anymore. But it shows us a depiction in the 1990s of a gay teacher who ends up being a foster parent to a gay student from the school. And so it's quite an extraordinary series in several ways. When we move into the 2000s, we start to see these more complex representations of teachers, which are good things in the beginning. When you see The Wire. Anybody a fan of season 4 of The Wire? Have you watched that? A couple people, a few people. I find season 4 is my favorite because of the education theme, but it's quite complex in the way it examines the institution of education. If you know the series The Wire, it looks at different institutions. It focuses on one each season, and season 4 is education. Not just in this particular classroom where you have this police officer who he wasn't very successful as a police officer and finds his way as a math teacher and excels in the classroom, not just in terms of that and the problems he faces, which are huge, but also in terms of looking at educational researchers from a university who get a grant, who come in and look for a while and start this program that's promising and then leave everybody high and dry. That's the good example. Looking a little more forward, you start to see this. What is it? It's my disturbing trend. I don't know if you watched Mike and Molly, but season 4 of Mike and Molly, who's been a teacher, and she's been, she seemed to like her job, and it's her family that's all wacky and so. Season 4 marks a radical departure, and let me preface this by saying that it's not, there are reasons for it. The showrunner left the popular show. I think there's also a reason related to the iconography of the Melissa McCarthy character. She was really successful in these movies where she plays broad comedy, and it's pretty almost farcical sometimes, and physical comedy, and they decided to play into what was popular on the big screen on the small screen. So instead of her being the normal person and all the other characters are wild and crazy, they injected that into her, and she goes into her classroom with these poor children who have no idea what's going on one day, and she just says, that her job is to, I think I wrote it down. What does she say? She says, don't settle, follow your dreams, wherever they take you, and then she throws herself out the window. It's her story, so that she just falls on the ground, but she's in a classroom just talking about how it's a dead-end job. She wants to be a writer. She's being held back. And that becomes, in a microcosm, the sort of depiction that we've seen. I don't think it's coincidental that these depictions of teachers that start trending negative coincide with public policy movements like No Child Left Behind, the deprofessionalization of teaching. These things don't happen in a vacuum. And so if you have a line of public discourse that is saying public schools are failing, teachers are failing, they're failing students, we have to find other solutions, popular culture feeds into that. And so it becomes this sort of cycle where the narratives get reinforced, which is extremely problematic for me on many levels. And I think it's something we need to really pay a lot of attention to. I want to talk, for the rest of the time that I'm talking, a little more about this idea of media studies and sort of tie this in together. I am really motivated in thinking about film, making, and television. I use them together, media text, visual text. I am very taken with this idea of intertextuality, because I think the competing messages that you find in text, the interrelationships that you find among texts, are something that we, I think, tacitly understand, but don't interrogate very carefully. I think this is critical because if you think about the way that we use media as a transmission engine for cultural values, you'll see that it is of prime importance that we take these things seriously. Think back a couple of thousand years, not that we were there, but the way that people decided how to tell the next generation what it meant to be human and what your place is like in connection to the world was by oral transmission. You'd sit around the fire and you'd recite from memory the Iliad, the Odyssey, all of these grand narratives that define who we are as a culture. That worked for a while. And I'm not going to get into my critique of masculinist narratives, although you can ask me about that later if you want to. But then we have the printing press. Now, what happens with the printing press? People think, oh my gosh, this is the end of civilization. People don't have to remember the stories anymore. They can just use these books to prop them up. Their brains are going to rot. These books are like cheat sheets, So, and instead what happens is books become our next big mode of cultural transmission, telling us who we are and what it means to be human, what that means, what our place is. And now we have visual texts. And I think if we are and I love books, I'm a reader, I'm a bookworm and we are pretty honest with ourselves, and especially if we have anything to do with young people, say anybody under 30, I think we have to be candid about the fact that our dominant engine of cultural transmission now is the moving image. It's movies, it's television, it's web series, it's video games. For better or for worse, those are the texts that are defining in terms of telling us what it is that we're all about as human beings. So this idea of intertextuality, though, goes beyond that. It's this idea that every text that you encounter has a porous boundary. John Fiske calls them leaking boundaries. And the notion of what is a text bears commenting on too. I mean, it actually can be a text. Somebody can text you and there is a narrative there, there's a story there. But the way we really think about it is, you know, a television show you see, a movie, an ad you see in a magazine, in a print magazine, a book. All of these things are texts. A story that your friend tells you. Your friend calls you and says, "You'll never believe what happened to me yesterday." Well, that's a narrative, that's a text. Your life is a text. Your life is a story that you're writing day by day, whether you're aware of it or not, but the choices that you make. But the choices that we make are informed by all of those other texts. Not so much in a linear way that you see X, so you do Y. It's much more of a cumulative effect. We have cultural scripts that emerge. And I bet you can think of some yourself. I mean, I can think of some. Let's say, well, I'll tell you an example I use in class a lot in my media theory criticism class. It has to do with Cinderella. So I open the class by reading the little golden book version of the Cinderella story. You've seen them in grocery store checkout lines, and it's illustrated with the Disney drawings. And then I, show them other texts that are related. A Tex Avery cartoon from World War II era called Swing Shift Cinderella. You've seen it, so you're laughing. Swing Shift Cinderella, where you have Cinderella and you have the wolf, and you have all of these. They're similar tropes. They draw on the story, but they expand it in certain ways because she ends up at midnight. She needs to be on the bus to work at the Lockheed plant. But in other ways, it's still very similar. I show a clip from Pretty Woman, the one where she's trying on all the clothes, and talk about the male gaze and complicate Cinderella for students by asking them to think about who's included and who's left out. And that's a central question. It's also a central question that ties back to this depiction of educators. Because right now, who's left out are these complex representations and the conventional good teacher, right? And then I end that class. Oh, I think I also show a country music video from the 1990s, a song by Susie Boggess, Hey Hey Cinderella, that talks about those things. And I close by reading a book that offers a competing text, which is Paperback Princess. Does anybody know this book, Paperback Princess? Well, people who know me know this book. This is something that I buy them 10 at a time. And every time I hear of a former student of mine having a child or expecting a child, I send the Paperback Princess because it does complicate this idea of gender roles. And that's what we need with these cultural scripts, because the problem is, if you have not seen yourself represented, or you have not seen yourself represented in popular culture as you see yourself in an authentic way, then you have a sense of the limitations rather than the possibilities of what is open for you. And I think this is true in terms of, like, going back to the Cinderella idea of the cumulative effect. When I went to college in the early 1980s, even though I was smarter than to realize that Cinderella was a real story, I think I had those kinds of preconceptions myself because it had been repeated so many different times in so many different ways. And I could inject myself into that story, you know, as a cisgender straight white woman. I could kind of see myself as Cinderella. And yet what that told me was not just a sense of that possibility, but a limitation, because I went into it thinking, oh, I'll go to college and in one form or another, I'll meet my equivalent of the, you know, the Brits, right? So I think that it's really important not just to unpack the stories in these dominant scripts, but also to inject as many competing narratives, competing scripts as we can find. And the most important thing that I ever teach in any class that I teach in media studies or gender studies when I'm teaching media is to combat this idea that people seem to have that, oh, it's just a movie. I'll never forget one student, the first class in a screenwriting class I was teaching, was talking before class with another student about something, and he was just saying, oh, it's just a movie. And it was just like with a laser beam focus. I don't think he knew what hit him when I'm talking about, the ideological properties of film and, going on and on and on and how these are value frameworks and so on. But I think that this is a critical thing to interrogate. And looking at the recent shows and looking at vice principals or Mike and Molly or Those Who Can't or Teachers, any of these series, I think that reinforces this idea that you're hearing repeated so often in newspaper articles, in politicians giving policy speeches about how public education is failing. And when that happens, that becomes a powerful sort of force to overcome because there aren't the stories that are competing with it right now in the marketplace of ideas. I think about two really interesting parallels in how people exploit this. I don't know if you've seen the documentary Waiting for Superman. And you've probably read some of the critiques. Maybe you've even seen the documentary that contradicts much of it in terms of how it presents charter schools in a very uncritical way, a very glowing, positive, selective, unfair way. Well, that documentary got a lot of attention. As documentaries go, it was pretty popular, but it really didn't reach the mass audience that the filmmakers and the people behind the film wanted it to reach, to get those ideas out there. So the same company produces a year or two later a film that I don't know if you've seen, Won't Back Down, that puts in a narrative frame a lot of the same ideas. You have a teacher who's burned out. You have a parent who feels that her child is not getting enough attention, and it's a state where there are the so-called trigger laws, and the school is failing, and so they decide to create a school and save the world. And well, that film didn't do too much better, really, than somewhat better in terms of box office, but not a whole lot. And it was quite obvious if you were attuned to such things. It was quite obvious the point they were trying to make. And that film, though, was released at the same time as a film that I don't think you've probably seen, but I have, called Here Comes the Boom. Has anybody seen Here Comes the Boom? It's one of the conventional good teacher movies, which means that for television with a good teacher and with the movies for the good teacher, there's a certain construction, a Hollywood model. So you have a teacher who's an outsider. You have a teacher who gets personally involved with students to try to save, cares about them. That's the key, cares about them. A teacher who personalizes the curriculum to work with students, who doesn't get along with administrators. Well, the premise of that film is that you have a principal who is the principal's almost always the bad guy. You have a principal who's going to decimate arts the arts, the music curriculum. Oh, and by the way, because you didn't know this, it's what's his name? Henry Winkler, who played Fonzie. He is the music teacher in this film. So they're going to decimate the music curriculum, and so this other teacher decides to go into mixed martial arts and fight to raise money to save music at the school. Why do I mention this? That's a silly movie that perpetuates some of these ideas that we've seen a million times over and over again, and it did significantly better at the box office at the same time than Won't Back Down. So I think that when I talk to you about these disturbing trends, I want to do that with the caveat that at least in cinema, we still see every year or two another one of those conventional good teacher movies. Those are still out there. They're just not the dominant form anymore. So I guess, the thing that I want to leave you with is that it's important to take sides, to be critical about the media that you watch. I believe that when you are watching a film or you are watching a television show, that is a creative act. Because what you're doing, based on your own experiences, based on the intertextual experiences that you bring into the process of viewing, you are writing this story. Does that make sense as you think about it? I mean, I know that people want to talk about film or watching as a passive activity. I don't think it is. I think when you engage with a text, you are producing the text. And I'm sure you probably feel that way, at least to some degree, about reading. You know how when you're reading a print text, especially a narrative, a fictional narrative, where you're reading a print text, do you have movies inside your head that you're reading? Do you have images inside your head, or is that just me? Nod, let me know. Okay. When you are watching a television show or a movie, how is that process for you? I mean, do you think other thoughts? Do you bring other experiences? Are you analyzing as you go? I think that even if you're not attuned to it and aware of it because you don't think about it in terms of, hey, I might write a review about this, or I might use this technique somewhere else. I think that is part of that process, because you are constructing what you see and contextualizing it in terms of your own experiences. To make that a little clearer, and then I want to get to questions, let me give you another film example that brings some of these things together in terms of how we think about texts, and how it's not the text that changes, it's the person watching it who changes over time. When I was about 6 years old, I saw this movie at the theaters. Back then, they used to release movies over and over and over again and make every little penny they could out of the movies. The movie I saw when I was 6 for the first time, one of my indelible experiences, was Gone with the Wind. And I watched Gone with the Wind with, I'm sure, really wide eyes. And I thought, oh, I can see why Scarlett likes Ashley. He is so smart and so nice and so unthreatening. And I just thought it was a big spectacle. I saw it again a few years later and I thought, oh, Ashley, he's so boring. I think Rhett Butler, he's pretty amazing, and she's so strong. She's there with those turnips, and I'm never going to be hungry again. Well, I saw it a few years later as a teenager, and I thought, oh my gosh, my face was burning with shame watching the film, because I was like, how did I, as a, we didn't use the term white privilege then, but I was watching it, I was thinking, oh my gosh, this movie is so racist. How did I never see in the other times I saw this film how racist, the egregious stereotyping, and then I saw it again, probably probably, this was maybe when I was in college, I don't remember. I saw it again, and I had another revelation, which was, oh my goodness, I saw the staircase scene. And I thought, and I was, how did I never see before that Scarlett was raped in this film? How did I never understand that? And so my point in saying this is that as we gain these critical tools, and as we gain perspectives on ourselves, as we grow, we become not just consumers, but producers. And right now, with the way, the types, the multitude of texts and the way we engage texts, I think that's important more than ever before. And so I would invite your questions so that we can, I can answer more specifically things that you're interested in. But if I've done nothing else, I just hope that you will look at maybe at texts and think about the layers of meaning, the competing messages, and how important it is for us to engage with that process.
We'll ask you to come to the microphone because we are streaming and recording this and it won't pick up your voice if you were just sitting in the audience. So if you'll come to the microphone with your question. Who's first? Come on.
Hi, I'm Mike Gamble, local, and I'm a public school educator. When I saw the title, I kind of thought, don't we have bigger battles, more important battles to fight there? What struck me, it was, I can't remember the year, 1992, Dan Quayle versus
Murphy Brown.
Murphy Brown, thank you. Clearly, I don't watch as much television as you do.
And I don't watch as much as I'd like to.
But part of the battle, and I don't know, it was 8-10 years ago, and I just forget the issue that spurred it, but it was on Fox, which I don't watch, but watch late night television, which makes fun of Fox, and their attacks on public teachers especially was relentless and horrible. And it seemed the only one who was taking up the defense was John Stewart, whose mother was a public school teacher. So.
Well, it's not hard. You follow the money, right? I mean, there are huge profit incentives for people to privatize education. So I think if you start paying attention to that, and I think it's important to think too about, do people really want an educated citizenry? Do people want engaged students? I think a lot of people don't. And I think popular culture is feeding into that. I don't think Hollywood producers are sitting there thinking, oh gee, what can we do to destroy public education? I don't think that's it. I think that it is that sort of cyclical thing where you start seeing these, public policy changes and this other sort of discourse, and they buy into that.
I mean, so do you think it's really a trend and part of the overall attacks on public education, or is it just an easy way to get a cheap laugh, or the stereotypical mean principal who doesn't care about the arts and the lazy teacher that wants to give out handouts all day?
Well, I think if you look at I think it is the default now because of preconceptions that a certain generation of people making television have bought into. They don't think about it that way. But if you look back, the cheap laughs didn't come at the expense of the teachers. If you look back at Mr. Potter, if you look back at these other teachers, that's not how it works. So I do think something is afoot. And I do think it is tied, not in ways that are direct, that we can point in a linear way, it's cause and effect. But I think in terms of this sort of tendency, this sort of this thread of discourse that has emerged, I think that's where it comes from. And I think it is of critical importance that we launch some kind of response to that, and that we don't watch those shows. Don't watch those shows. Punish people where it hurts with that. And I'm just not. I'm not sure exactly. I tell you what I did the other week. I have a former student who's working at a production company, and I just tell them, I say, you know, I point it out to people. I think that's the main thing we can do. I said, when are you going to come up with a good teacher TV show? I think we could use one of those again. So do you still think it's a silly topic and that we shouldn't talk about it?
No, I just like to see more of a fight against the real attacks.
Yeah. Well, I don't think one is more important than the other. I agree with you, but I think we shouldn't disregard this as also having some influence on that, because if you are telling people, see, the thing is, okay, you're a teacher, I'm a teacher, we have had a certain number of teachers in our lives. We have seen many, many more teachers in films and movies than we have actually had in our experience. I think so. Do you not think so? Oh, you raise your eyebrows.
Yeah, no.
Most people. Let's say most people. Most people have more, in terms of just raw numbers, experiences of watching teachers. And also, and if you've had one teacher in your, you know, year, and you see a number of different movies, you see good teachers, you see bad teachers, those depictions, those representations give you a sense of what constitutes a good and a bad teacher. And when you see those patterns represented over and over and over again, it creates more of a influence in some ways about what is good or bad than maybe what you experience. It certainly sets your expectations. And when we're looking at that traditional good teacher, that's not altogether great either, right? Because if you have these unrealistic expectations of what a good teacher should be, well, that has its own pitfalls.
Mike, you're taller than I am. I've been tracking this thing myself because I've been very interested in school reform for the last several years. And I'm wondering if you see what I would call a kind of movement toward making reform lingo trite. And the reason I say this is, as I watch the dialogue and participate in the dialogue, I'm beginning to see the conversation shift slightly. And I had a revelation recently from a filmmaker in Massachusetts who wrote and produced a film called Passion to Teach. And this is the maverick teacher who, in spite of reform, engages students in intrinsic motivation and, by example, not by ideology, by example, becomes the teacher that we remember. I had a couple of teachers review the film with me, and both of them said, I remember when we used to be able to teach that way. So my real question is, am I dreaming, or is the conversation beginning to shift?
Well, the shift that I've noticed in television is not that specifically, but it's a different type of deprofessionalization of teaching to look at the informal teacher, or the teacher who works for a nonprofit. So is anybody watching Insecure on HBO? So Issa, it works for a nonprofit, and I forget what's the name of it. We got y'all, yeah. You know, so there's Issa coming into public schools from the outside. And also, I spent a lot of time looking at the TV show Speechless this year. I don't know if any of you have seen it or not. And again, it's the same sort of cliched representations, for the most part, of teachers, mostly the principal. But the informal teacher is Kevin, who's the personal aide to the student who has cerebral palsy and can't speak. He literally is the voice for this student. And what I noted about both of those is they're both presented, I mean, Issa kind of is lukewarm on her job sometimes she likes it. It's frustrating for her for various structural reasons with the nonprofit. And with Kevin, he's definitely contrast as this voice of reason, wise person against the principal who just spouts jargon and is spineless and doesn't know, she's afraid of the mother, she's actually, the show's a little better than that. We see her vulnerability later on as the season progresses. But what I noticed was kind of interesting about these two characters who are presented as bright and caring and engaged people is that they are both played by actors of color. That's significant. But they're also both outside of the formal structure of education. So it's sort of implying to me that making a difference, a real difference in a student's life, or doing something innovative that challenges the structure of public education has to come from the outside. And in these two shows, current shows on the air, it is coming from not just the outside, but from something that is sort of challenging traditional public education. I also, since I had this hurt foot, I also, for the first 2 weeks, didn't feel like doing anything at all. And I binge watched a lot of television, and I watched The Fosters. Because one of my former students and his wife are story editors on The Fosters. Does anybody watch The Fosters? The Fosters is fascinating to me because it is a charter school, and one of the two moms in the family is the assistant principal, a woman of color as well. But what is interesting to me about it is they go to great pains in that series to say, we're a charter school, but we're like a real charter school. We're not one of those charter schools that's, about making money. So I don't really have a specific answer to you in terms of trends because not to use jargon myself, but there aren't that many data points because really we don't have tons of depictions of teachers on television. And at the rate we're going, that's actually at this moment a kind of a good thing, right? But I'm not sure. I do think that that when we do see, especially administrators, that it is a kind of a jargon-heavy, ineffectual, not part of the real world sort of idea that we get.
I enjoyed your presentation. It was very informative. I'm a little surprised you didn't mention two examples of really bad teachers. One is on TV and one is in the movies.
Oh, tell me.
Well, one is the movie Bad Teacher.
Oh, I have written about that, and actually it's in it's a open source piece, so anybody can go read that journal.
Okay, but I just thought
I've given considerable thought. Well, let me just give you the bad teacher thing for just the.
And then I'll mention the other one, and then you can talk about bad teachers. And the second one, which is on television, it was a Netflix series, Breaking Bad.
Oh yeah,
the main character is a
Breaking Bad's in there.
chemistry teacher who runs a meth ring.
Right.
So I'm just a little curious about how those two depictions fit into your scenario of bad teachers.
Well, Bad Teacher, the movie, was fascinating to me because there is no good. Bad Teacher, the movie, is one of the most damaging things I've ever seen, and not for the reason you think. I'm not talking about for the Cameron Diaz character specifically. We know she's bad. She's shallow. She's bad in every way. The problem for me with that movie is that Miss Squirrel, the good teacher, turns out to be a bad teacher too. So when you have the teacher who's positioned as the contrast to the bad teacher turn out to be worse in terms of character and everything than the eponymous bad teacher, then what you're saying is there are no good teachers. None. No, they're not there. So that movie, I think, is incredibly destructive. And there was a spin-off TV show of that. And Breaking Bad is interesting because when you see Walter White in the classroom, he's a good teacher. He's doing experiential learning. he knows his stuff, he's engaged. But again, it does speak to the things we were talking about in terms of the job doesn't pay enough. It's all of the negative parts. He can't support his family. So it's this sort of justification for what he does. And he's really good at what he does precisely because he knows his science. So it's a fascinating, Breaking Bad's fascinating. Yeah, thank you for asking this.
You talked a lot about film and text on television. I'm curious your thoughts on how the democratized access to publishing, essentially, is affecting the perception of teachers, especially with the prevalence of student cell phone footage of what's happening in classrooms or around the school that traditionally wouldn't have been able to, be produced or
I don't think
consumed.
I've really thought about that. I mean, what I have thought about, because in the new edition of the Hollywood curriculum book, I wrote a chapter about teachers crossing the line, teachers who have sex with students, and how in the movies frequently that's not depicted as a bad thing. In the two examples that I use in the book, it's not. And I've thought a lot more about how social media erases barriers between teachers and students and fosters some of those relationships. I haven't thought very much about, I tell you what, this is being recorded, so I mean, people will know that. There are times when I say things in the classroom and I kind of think, wow, how would I feel if if this video, I'd end up on that list of like those 20, however many it is, professors who are like the most dangerous professors in here. I kind of doubt that I would crack that list, but I do kind of think about that sometimes. I think about those things because I think about the classroom as a conversation space. I guess I think about all of this as one big conversation. I think about all my classes that way, and I think about wanting to be present and to be authentic and to be open to conversation and to what students say, and try to create that for students too, because my classes are by and large media studies classes. We're working with media texts, and sometimes they're quite controversial media texts. So I guess I think about it, but I also think sometimes, I also think a little bit sometimes about the way, I'll just say it. I always say whatever I think, but the way my privilege insulates me from some of that, because I don't think I'm perceived as a very threatening person. So sometimes I feel like I can have those kinds of interactions. And I noticed for the workshop tomorrow, that was one of the questions that one of the people who's going to participate had about how do you meet students where they are? And I think that, I think part of it is practice, and I think part of it is I have tenure, and I think part of it is just trying not to be afraid. But I still sometimes, even like within the last couple of years, I have had those moments where I kind of think, wow, this could be problematic. How would I feel if everybody in the world saw this class session that we just had, where we're trying to, in terms of intertextuality, where we're trying to deal, because I'm very keen on trying to bring things that are happening out in the world into the class, or things that are happening on our campus. And sometimes those things are controversial. They're not easy. And trying to bring it into that space so that we can, I am sort of the eternal optimist. Try to bring it into that space where maybe we can find some common ground. And I don't think I necessarily addressed your question because I'm not sure I understood it. But was that okay?
I like the conversation. Because I think one of the things that's tough, especially with YouTube specifically and the sometimes criticism they get for their algorithm and how it sorts videos is even if there are good positive messages about teachers out there, they don't crack your list. The
okay,
top
I see
10
what you're saying,
top 10 worst professors or whatever always, for whatever reason, based on how the magic math works behind the scenes, those are what get to be popular, and not necessarily immediately because that's what people want to watch, but because it gets put in front of us.
That's a much bigger question. I mean, and that question, we can apply that to every sphere that we all share, and I don't know the answer to that. I wish I did. And I spend a lot of time thinking about that. And I spend a lot of time thinking about what psychic space I want to spend time in. Because if I am, I started out working in television news was the first thing I did. And I used to be an absolute news junkie. And I still read a couple of, New York Times, Washington Post, even sometimes the Wall Street Journal. I still read newspapers. I can't stand being engaged the way I used to be because it's overwhelming to me. So I don't know. I'm the worst person you could ask that question because my coping mechanisms have been not that great except limit my exposure.
Hi, my name is Natalie. I'm a graduate student in the College of Education. Thank you for sharing your time with us today.
I'm happy to be here now.
I'm troubled in my own wonderings about the word bad in your title. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit with us about what your vision is of a good teacher as they would be represented.
Well, I'm talking about media teachers, right? Obviously. So in bad, let me go back to tell you and the framework is explained in the books a lot better. So in starting this research, since you're a graduate student, this research started in a class I took in my curriculum theory class. And we were looking at, reading a lot of different stuff. And I read Dwayne Huebner's 5 value frameworks. There's lots of different value frameworks, but something about this kind of stuck with me. And I thought, I want to look at movies and see if these value frameworks fit. Now, for Dwayne Huebner, they're neutral. In the movies, they're not. There are 3 value frameworks that invariably, and in TV it's the same, although in TV it doesn't even have to have anything to do with curriculum, it's watered down from that. But there are 3 value frameworks that are always associated with the good teacher, sometimes more, sometimes, it's the aesthetic, the ethical, and the political are associated with the good teacher. What's associated with the bad teacher is the technical or the scientific. By technical, it's talking about outcomes, it's test scores, or discipline. And then the scientific is about the creation of knowledge, which is kind of interesting if you think about it. So the idea of creating knowledge in the movies, when that happens, it's usually because the teacher is trying to exploit the student in some way. And it doesn't happen very often. You don't see it very often. So it could be like in Good Will Hunting, where the Lambeau wants to use him, or in Real Geniuses, where Hathaway wants to have these guys do these defense contracting, stuff like that. So when I talk about bad, that's what I'm talking about, the sort of depiction. In Bad Teacher, it is more expansive than that because she's just presented as a bad person. She doesn't even try to teach. There's no pretense until she wants to win that money that's available. So that's what I kind of think about. And when I think about good teacher, and I will say that some of the research bears this out in terms of the teaching and learning research. If you ask students the most important thing to them about a teacher in terms of thinking, I'm talking about real students now, not just movie students, but real students, have said in repeated studies that the most important thing to them in terms of how they measure a teacher as a good teacher is that they think that teacher cares about them. And that is really consistent with what happens with these good teachers in the movies, because it is about that interpersonal relationship. You think back to one of the early good teacher movies, Goodbye Mr. Chips, 1939. And the example I use is when he's kept the kids from going to play cricket, and they lose the match, and everybody's all upset. He's kept them in as a discipline thing, and after they realize they lose the match, one of them says, "Well, it's your fault because he's our best player," and Mr. Chips looks at the students, Mr. Chipping, and says, "Boys, if I've lost your friendship, I've lost everything that matters." And from that moment, that becomes part of that issue. Now, I don't think caring is a sort of what we say in the comm area, it's a polysemic term, right? So somebody said something about Murphy Brown. When Murphy Brown came out, and Dan Quayle was like saying, "Oh, it's a loss of family values, she's a single mom," the Annenberg School of Communication ran 100 focus groups to try to figure out what family values were. And what they discovered in doing these focus groups was that everybody supported family values. Nobody agreed on what family values were. Nobody agreed. And so I think the same thing, is true with some of these terms. We all know what we think we all support a teacher who cares, but we might all have completely different definitions of what constitutes caring, because it's an open term, polysemic, many meanings, and we all can support that. So it gets very complex, and that's why I think it's important to look at these texts from as many different perspectives as you can to try to figure out within the competing messages, because a text is never one thing, right? Drama is set up around conflict, so you have conflicting ideas, conflicting personalities, conflicting actions and reversals. And when you look at it, it's really a rhetorical, critical sort of act that's not just about what's happening, and this is something we'll talk about in a workshop tomorrow too, but how things are presented. Because that's as important, the form of these media texts, that is every bit as important as the content.
Okay. We can take one more, but then it's 7.
But I'll be here and I'll answer any other questions individually.
Right, that's exactly right. Then you can talk with her individually.
I appreciate your comments tonight. You obviously have a lot of insight into film making and TV production. So I'm wondering, what do you think is driving this negative portrayal of teachers? And I like Natalie's observation, by the way. What's driving the negative portrayal of teachers in the media, and is there any hope of turning that around?
Well, let me go back to the cheap joke. Who said that about is it just a cheap joke? Let me go back to that. Because I do think it becomes a shorthand, but it's been cumulative. So and part of it, let me say yes, I think there is going to be hope, because it doesn't ever stay the same, right? And so we have all of these years of, at times, a valorization of teaching or sentimental sorts of looks at teaching. And we don't really want that either. We want something that's more complex, but not totally unsympathetic. So in terms of patterns of representation, we do make movement forward. Things do change as I think we're in a sort of a cynical age right now. If you look at, I don't know what everybody else is watching, but I watch a lot of, I don't watch nearly as many things as I wish I could, but it's frustrating for me with all this great TV out there, and it seems like it is very dark. That's kind of the tone, that's kind of where we are right now in terms of the dominant narratives, the more creative things that we're seeing. I think once this becomes, and I think we're pretty much at that, if we had more of a critical mass of representations, and I'm glad we don't, but if we had more of a critical mass of them, I think that we would see the turn faster. Because then it becomes, people want to work against the grain and do something that's a little different. So I'm hopeful. I don't know when. There's a part of me that thinks that I'm on research leave this semester, and I'm teaching away from my campus next semester. And there's a part of me that thinks that what I should do next semester is I don't think I think I came to this just when you said that. I don't think I had really thought about it before, but there's a part of me that thinks I should write a spec script for that sort of scenario, you know, and bring this into that. You know, I don't know that I'll do that, but somebody should.
So I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to give credit to Stephanie Schrader and Elizabeth Curran for setting all of this up. They also have a reception